Greetings and welcome to the online content from ECFC's Advocacy Summit. I'm Christa, Executive Director of ECFC. Thank you so much for joining us. I'd like to extend a warm thank you to our sponsor Visa, who made it possible to share the recorded content with all ECFC members. ECFC is the only organization advocating for flexible spending products, and we've been a trusted source of expertise in the field since 1979. Before we dive straight into the content, we'd like to remind you of ECFC's antitrust statement. Various state and federal laws prohibit the exchange of information among competitors regarding matters pertaining to price, refusals to deal, markets division, tying relationships, and other topics which might infringe upon the antitrust laws and regulations, and that no such exchange or discussion will be tolerated during this meeting. I'd like to take a quick moment and thank all of our sponsors. We appreciate very much all of your support in supporting both ECFC and the CDH industry at large. So what exactly is an advocacy summit and why is it so important? ECFC's Advocacy Summit is an opportunity for our members to come together as an industry, sharpen our advocacy skills, and establish ongoing relationships with legislators. Each year, we meet in Washington, D.C. and learn the latest regulatory and legislative news in tax advantage programs. After reviewing our policy priorities and refining our message, we break up into small groups and lobby directly with congressional offices. Especially after an election year, it's more important than ever to educate a new Congress on consumer-driven healthcare and remind legislators that ECFC is a trusted industry resource. I invite you to join us in person next year in DC and participate in our next Advocacy Summit. When we come together and share our knowledge and lived experience with policymakers, we can make real change happen. Thank you for your support of ECFC and the industry. Next up, you will hear Karen Frost, who is with Alight Solutions and is the chair of ECFC.
I'm with a company called Alight Solutions, and we are the successor company of a company many of you all know, Hewitt Associates. Hewitt was one of the original members of ECFC, along with some of you. And I thought it would be kind of fun for us just to spend a minute and look at all the stuff that has happened since ECFC was founded, since we became a member, since many of you became members, and look at all the great enhancements we have. You know, we have different types of accounts. We have expansion of those accounts over the years. And the reason this is in a really boring color is because if you look at the colorful version is all the influence that the advocacy summits and the related activities that ECFC has contributed to over the life of all of these accounts. So many of you were around for the time, or especially during the ACA was probably the one I remember the most, where FSAs were actually on the chopping block. They were gonna pay for healthcare reform. And it was through the efforts of ECFC where we had a Save My FSA campaign. We had a huge amount of activity, and I can actually say comfortably, and please, those of you who are in the audience who were part of this, we were intimately involved in saving FSAs. And many of these activities throughout the course of the past, the number of decades that are on there, 50 years, ECFC was integral in all of that. So I wanted to thank you all for being here because we're the leader. We're the only organization that focuses on consumer-directed benefit accounts. And look at all that we've accomplished over the past number of decades in terms of growing them, building out all of your businesses that actually run these accounts. So kudos to all of you. And again, I promised you I was only kidding that I was going to read the words, but I thought it would be fun for you all to see all the great activity that we have taken on over the years. And so what's next for us? So we have the alphabet soup of accounts here on the left. There are some, maybe there'll even be more in the future. But at the end of the day, our job is to lead that compliance effort to actually make sure that these accounts are running well. You guys are all part of that activity. And when we go on the Hill, we're going to do three things. And it's a little hard to read on the slides. So we're going to be, we as ECFC, and when we talk on the Hill, we're going to do three things. We're focused on expansion. Who can take advantage of these accounts? How much money they can put in. Oh, We want to strengthen the accounts to make sure that they are available now and in the future. And last but not least, we want simplification. So yesterday we were talking about some newer ideas called ICRAs, been around since 2019. They're really interesting, but without simplification, it's going to be kind of hard to implement. So those are our three key overriding themes. As we go down to the Hill, we'll get into a lot more detail. But as you think about ECFC and the role you as leaders in this business and we as an organization are playing, it's all around these key activities. Expand these accounts, strengthen these accounts, and simplify. All right? Are you guys ready to hear what's next? Yes? All right. All right. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Sage Eastman, who is our master lobbyist from Mehlman Consulting, and he's going to share some perspectives on what's going on in Washington and answer any questions you have. All right. Thank you. Go Sage.
Can I have the clicker?
You want the clicker? All right.
I do. All right. Let's see. I'm pretty sure my presentation is designed to make sure you all show up to happy hour tonight. So let's see here. Uh-oh. I'm getting the 1 second. I'll filibuster for a minute. I'll pretend I'm a Senate guy for a minute. All right, here we are. So I thought we would start before you go up to the Hill, and I know tomorrow morning we'll talk a little bit about the Hill visits and what that's like. So today we wanted to start with a little bit more of a broad perspective and think about just sort of the overall dynamics of what's happening in Washington in our politics and sort of where we are today and where we're headed. Again, where we're headed is to the bar later. Trust me when we get through this here. Obviously, a lot happening. And I think some of the things we want to talk about, right, is Trump 2.0. And it's not the same as 1.0. There are differences here, but very much kind of in like a lion right now in terms of everything sort of all at once going on. I think the other big thing we'll start to focus on is sort of what are the big four issues that this administration and the Republicans are focusing on since, for the first time since 2017 and 2018, the Republicans have both the House, the Senate, and the White House again. So it's really about the Republican agenda right now. What sort of are the other issues that are coming into play here? Then looking through a little bit of the challenges, the congressional politics, and then lastly, just some recommendations as we think about how do we engage in this environment. So start with the president. I think there are some really key differences that we have to think about, and that 45 doesn't equal 47, right? Which is Trump 45, the 45th president of the United States, also the 47th president of the United States with President Biden sitting in between there. And I would start just with the attitude, right? This time around, Donald Trump isn't the outsider, business, real estate mogul, headline seeker, okay, maybe still the headline seeker, that he was when he came into office as sort of an outsider trying to take over the Republican Party. This time around, he understands the Oval Office. He has sat behind the Resolute desk for 4 years, and he gets what it's like to engage with his cabinet members, with the bureaucracy that fills Washington, with Congress, right? There's just an entirely different level of understanding that he brings to this. This is true of presidents in a second term, right? It's just that this second term doesn't happen to be immediately preceding the first term. So there's a big difference in the attitude. There's also a big difference in terms of sort of that insatiable hunger to achieve something right now, right? When he came in 4 years ago, there was a lot of, well, let's figure this out. I've got some of my MAGA, my Make America Great Again folks. I've got some of the traditional Republicans are in here. We're gonna see how this all works. I'll figure out what do I really want to get done. This time around, I think he very much knows that he has but 4 years, and as we'll talk about later, probably really only 2 years, if history is any guide here, where he's got this total control Republican Washington in which to implement his agenda. In 2 years, frankly, isn't really true because we know the election happens in November. He doesn't get it until January. I've lost 2 months out of 24 already. The campaign season will start earlier. Let's say I lose another 6 months there. So now I don't have 2 years or 4 years to get everything I want done. I've got 18 months, right? So there's, again, this just sort of this massive drive. I think also there's more of a shift, and we certainly saw a lot of disruption in the first Trump administration. And what you're seeing now is more of a Silicon Valley type, break as much as you can, put back together what you have to later. Type of attitude to this, right? Not sort of a traditional real estate mogul approach to business, much more gone the Elon Musk kind of Silicon Valley style of break it all, figure out what has to go back together, and go from there. So these are kind of the big attitude differences. Politically, though, also huge differences right now. I'm going to say this, I'm going to remind you all, Mehlman Consulting is a bipartisan firm. There are 11 Republican lobbyists, there are 11 Democratic lobbyists. The Dems are in total disarray. All right? That's a quote from one of my Democratic partners at the firm. And I think back, and actually there was a similar time when Barack Obama was first elected president. Republicans were in total disarray. Democrats had all three branches. They had 60 votes in the Senate, a supermajority. They didn't even need to compromise with the Republicans in the Senate, where you typically have to, because the Senate is ruled by a supermajority vote. We didn't have anybody. We had a newly elected minority leader in Mitch McConnell. John Boehner was the minority leader in the House, who'd been a part of leadership back in the Gingrich days, got kind of run out and was coming back in, but certainly wasn't that Newt Gingrich or Nancy Pelosi type figure, right, who commanded a national stage. So we were down, we were out, we were in disarray. I think that's very similar to what the Democrats find themselves in right now, at least in terms of Washington. So there's no real leader of the resistance here. Politically, I'd also say President Trump dominates the Republican Party in a way he did not 8 years ago. 8 years ago, there were a number of members of Congress, especially on the Senate side, who'd been in town for a long time, who'd run a primary race, won a general race, without Donald Trump ever being on the ballot. Today, the number of Republicans elected in office in Washington, D.C. who can claim that? 0. Right? Everybody's had to face a primary with Donald Trump on the ballot. Everybody's gotten elected in the Trump. They may have some history before that, but they have certainly done this now in the Trump era. Much more commanding figure within the party than he was even 8 years ago when he first got elected. I'd also just say sort of the MAGA element. It has matured. Just the way the president has matured in office and he understands it better, the MAGA movement, the outsiders that he brought to Washington, D.C., now have a better understanding, right? So that team does. It's not just the traditional incumbents, I put myself in that category, who've been around town for a long time and understand these policies. You now have a second generation of that outsider coming to be insider. Globally, obviously, there are also some huge differences. You think about what's going on in Europe, what's happening in the Middle East. You think about the inflation around the world. America, oddly enough, not the worst place on all of this. U.S. is relatively stronger than we were in 17. And when you think about world leaders, most of them have turned over since then. You've got a few. You've got Vladimir Putin and others who are still around, right? We just saw an election in Europe. We just saw an election in Canada where we're switching we're switching people there. So we'll have to see how that 51st state thing goes. Right? I'm not allowed to talk about Greenland in my house. I don't know how it's going in yours, but no, that was a new one. I really wasn't expecting going home the other day and saying, no talk of Greenland at the dinner table. Okay. Take that off the vacation list. But so these are all the kind of like really big differences, but what's not changed, and this is important as well, right, is the chaos factor, right? We're sort of living by tweet again, or by X, or by post on Truth Social, right? I'm not very good with social media, so we have to figure out. So, and that's again, I think in the first time around, we thought a lot of this was a bug in the system, right? It was just an anomaly in that he would learn to sort of come to Washington and behave Washingtonian, like a Washingtonian. He hasn't, right? It is a feature, it is a hallmark, it is a brand from Trump, very similar to 1.0. I would still say transactional, right? And by this I mean Donald Trump does not have a traditional conservative ideology by which he practices. He's not particularly philosophical about the approach to government as well. Very transactional. Now that doesn't mean he doesn't have very deep beliefs. We know the word tariff is his fourth favorite word in the English language. It's true. He's actually said it. I've been in the room when he said it. The other three, by the way, are God, family, and country. But he still has this art of the deal mentality, right? What do I need to do to get to where I want to go? And I'm willing to break very traditional lines to get there. Tariffs would be a great example, right? How do I negotiate with other countries? First Republican since President McKinley at the turn of the century to sort of engage in this type of tariff behavior. And the goals are different this way too, right? I mean, clearly, or similar, I should say. Clearly it's the dominance factor, right? I'm gonna brand everything as in the Donald Trump version of America. And so you've got some pretty big differences that we're facing as we go into this second term, and I'll remind you, we're not even in month 2 yet of this administration, right? We are about 8 weeks in from the inauguration, so a long way to go. So I think the other piece we think about a lot is, what are they doing in terms of as he fills out the cabinet? We've seen a lot of them trying to repeat what works. So they had a good economic team. They trumped the Trump tax bill in 2017, the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, which is why actually we're all back here right now, because big portions of it are expire, which gives us a chance to talk about account-based plans. So you see kind of a very similar, you've got kind of the Wall Street traditional economist going in there, very similar to Trump 1.0 as Trump 2.0. The trade team, again, still very similar on the tariff front, the aggressiveness, the negotiations, renegotiation of things like what we used to call NAFTA, now USMCA. Foreign policy, again, some typical operation stuff. These are the places where he saw successes in his first term, and not surprisingly, went right back to that. Now, where the president felt less successful or frustrated with the results of his team, DOJ, defense, healthcare, what they ultimately did in terms of reorganizing American government, not super happy with those results. And so this time around, you see a whole new brand of loyalists going into those jobs. Folks like Secretary Hesketh over at the Department of Defense. You've got folks like RFK Jr. And if you want to prove that Donald Trump isn't ideological, you can see a Republican picking RFK Jr. To lead HHS. Dr. Oz. You've got Elon Musk coming in, again, to sort of reorganize the federal government. So people who are extremely loyal and willing to break the system and bend it to his will, as opposed to these things. So again, a lot of similarities and a lot of really important differences as we go through this. I think the last big thing I would sort of start with here as we think about Donald Trump, and this is a little bit of a cheat graph, I'm gonna go ahead and admit it, right? So this looks like he's on a heck of a run, constantly going up in the polls. And it's true. Donald Trump, as we sit here today, is more popular on net than he ever has been. He's still not popular, right? He's still in the hole, just by a little bit. But what we see is a very motivated Republican Trump base that's feeling there. We've seen a huge swing in the independents to sort of vote for this kind of disruption here in Washington. You guys have heard me describe it before as kind of a hand grenade theory of politics, right? Where we're just frustrated as Americans, so we keep rolling a hand grenade into Washington and see what comes back out. But you see the independent swing, and obviously, if we break down this poll numbers, you've got record sort of disapproval amongst Democrats of the administration. But nonetheless, through all these years from when he very first announced his campaign, coming down the escalator at Trump Tower in New York, and he was down 23 points, upside down by 23 points, to basically being at a statistical even right now. So, emboldened would be the other word I'd use to describe where President Trump is right now. If anyone needs the bar, I believe the card's open. No? Okay, we'll keep going. So, what are the big issues we're facing right now in Washington, right? Tariff spending, taxes, and immigration. Take a quick moment to spin through these. The trade wars are huge. Faster, bolder, broader. We're doing this all at once, right? We've got steel tariffs going in. We have Canada tariffs going in. We have Mexico tariffs going in. We have Chinese tariffs going in. We have European Union tariffs going in. This is an all-out trade war. Oh, wait, by the way, none of them have really actually gone into effect yet, right? The American auto industry, 3 weeks ago, thought they had a deal when he was going to announce his first tariffs on Canada and Mexico. That afternoon, Friday afternoon, they left the White House thinking they had a deal and an exemption. Friday evening, President announced across-the-board cuts. A week later, President decided to exempt the American auto industry. Today, yeah, I don't know. What I do know is that come April 2nd, because he doesn't want to do it on April Fool's Day, truly, that's the issue. But on April 2nd, we're going to see these tariffs, whatever they are at that point, go into effect. From now, I was with a member of Congress last night who had a great phrase about this, that the president, one of the reasons he loves tariffs is because he views it as a great negotiating tactic to escalate to de-escalate, right? I feel like it's the way my kids negotiate with me, right? Or maybe I negotiate with them. Here's $20 to go to dinner. Oh, you want nothing? Great, that's fine with me too. So this is where we're going, right, is we're trying to do all of this broader end game, and I will say the president very much believes in this, right? He is in a 50-year effort to try and remake supply chains and domestic manufacturing again. You know, he is trying to think back and see what we lost in the 80s and the 90s and the early 2000s as we globalized and we lost manufacturing to around the globe. How do we do that, right? How do we incur this short-term turmoil or pain to sort of readjust the American economy? I think on this front too, there's less resistance, right? We've seen the business community try and figure out where their exemptions are. They haven't stood up and fought. More importantly, I would say, you know, from his base, farmers are usually some of the most sensitive people to tariffs because we're selling most of our agricultural goods around them. But you know what most farmers did out in the Midwest the last time around? They said, go stick it to China. I'm willing to take a couple of bad seasons on my soybeans. It's an interesting spot, right? They gave them the leeway. Now corporations seem to be doing this as well. And again, I think the different environment that we still see here is, right, is China continues to play a larger and larger role in the global stage. And how do we as Americans combat that? And how do we position on this? All of this leading to a much higher stakes as he looks at his trade wars and the import tariffs. On the spending, oops, did I skip one? Nope, all right. On the spending front, I put the bulldozer up there because I heard a great term the other day, bulldozing of American government, right? I kind of stole it. Wish I'd thought of it myself, but I haven't. But you have the DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, which I love because it's a clearly success because it started out with 2 people heading it, now only has 1. I mean, that's great progress, right? I mean, it's just amazing. Just think what it could do for the rest if we can do that to itself. But what you have is still this huge fight, and we actually just got through it. Bill and I were talking about it earlier. Last night, Republicans did something that they have never done since I've been in Washington, a little over 20 years now, a little over 30 years in the business. Republicans on their own passed a continuing resolution, which is a fancy way of saying we just said, yeah, keep the lights on at the same current cost. Republicans have never done that before on their own. Pushed it through, lost 1 vote on the Republican side, picked up 1 vote on the Democratic side. Now that bill sits over in the Senate. It's going to be up to the Senate to decide whether or not the government shuts down on Friday or whether or not we continue to pass this continuing resolution. Again, the Senate operates a little differently. It's going to take some bipartisan support. So the Democrats, because Republicans only have 53 seats, they'll need 7 Democratic votes at least, but we'll see what happens. But so these things are really hard to do, but they got through that first initial cliff here. On the debt ceiling, right? If we default on the debt, who knows what happens to the markets? We've never done this in our history before. You know what Republicans have never done on their own before either? Raise the debt ceiling. How does that play out this year? And then I think lastly, you have this fight, which we're hearing a lot about the agencies right now and the mostly in the bulldozing sort of section of firing massive pieces of the workforce. Big news out of the Department of Education this morning in terms of trying to reduce the size and ultimately, I guess, eliminate the Department of Education. What's going to work? This is congressionally appropriated funds. Can the executive, can the administration, can the president just simply sit on those funds and say no? That'll end up at the Supreme Court. It goes back to the 1974 Impoundment Act. The courts have upheld it for a long time, but nobody's ever really tested it to this extent. So you have massive spending fights here in Washington on lots of fronts going on. Taxes. In 2017, Republicans passed a $1.5 trillion tax cut. To maintain the status quo, that number has gone from 1.5 trillion to 4.5 trillion. That's a pretty, I mean, that's a good return if you're selling a house over 8 years, but you know, if you're trying to deal with tax policy, it's huge. I would say the other piece too, that doesn't even count roughly $1 trillion that the president wants to do from the campaign. No tax on tips, no tax on overtime, no tax on the loan for your leased car, a couple of other pieces in there. And so you have this massive cliff at the end of the year where if Congress doesn't act, America will see a $4.7 trillion tax hike. And so Republicans are going to use the budget reconciliation process, which is what they used in 2017. It's what the Democrats used in 22 to pass the Inflation Reduction Act. It's what the Democrats used in 2009 to pass Obamacare, right? This is the tool we use to get to a simple majority. But they've got to do it. And they've got a super tight margin in the House and a still relatively small margin in the Senate. So taxes, huge, huge issue for this Congress. And I think the big question is do they simply just want to extend the current policy, right? Keep what's in place, keep those 2017 reforms, or do they want to make new ones, right? Do they want to add that $1 trillion roughly that the president promised during the campaign trail? For us, do they want to do some of those expansions and strengthening and simplifying that Karen talked about a minute ago, right? This is an opportunity for us to get into a tax bill. And there are big political sticking points in here, right? Do you do a business SALT increase, state and local tax increase to help offset some of these costs? Do you extend these pieces only for a couple of years or can you make them permanent? These are the big decisions before Congress right now. How do you pay for all of this? Or can you magically use the revenue raised from tariffs, which again is mostly American consumers paying for higher priced goods made overseas, to help offset this? This is a huge multi-trillion-dollar question that Congress is facing right now. I think the other big issue that's dominating in Washington right now is obviously immigration and the border. It was a major focal point of the campaign. Interestingly enough, it actually hasn't dominated the legislative front so much. I think in large part because, as the president said in the State of the joint address to Congress, because it's not technically a State of the Union the first time you do it, right? Border crossings are down to near historic lows. And so this has taken a little bit of the immediate pressure to get something done on this issue, but it is still very much front and center to the president and his advisors. Big questions around what they'll be able to do. Can they get the money to do the border? What are the economic impacts of this if all of a sudden we choke off immigration in this country, which are obviously a huge portion of the workforce here? What's the backlash that happens, especially if we start going forward with deportations? You've already started to see some of that, not on the mass scale that the president talked about during the campaign, but some on the smaller side. So big, giant questions around this. I know, I gotta take a breath there. It feels like a lot. Karen, is the bar open? Maybe I need a drink. All right, so what's everything else? Let's take a quick look. So, of course, after all this stuff, what else is out there? Major push by the administration to undo the Biden administration regulations, right? Basically, and this is fairly typical when we see party switch at the White House, an immediate freeze on all new regulations. But also, as we saw just in the last 48 hours, massive attempt to start to roll back pieces of the Affordable Care Act, right? Starting to change those enrollment periods, those special enrollment periods. Starting to look at how we're defining income and how often we're going to test income pieces, right? So there's a big push from the regulatory state. Almost nationwide, I was going to say government-wide, but I feel like nationwide pushback on DEI initiatives, right? Basically telling every agency to go ahead, get rid of those posts inside your agencies and go find those who you regulate and oversee and find out what they're doing in this space and shut it down. You've got a purge of the state, right? Firing in the rework of the Department of Justice and the FBI. This initiative to sort of do a 10-to-1 in terms of repeal of regulations to new regulations. You've got the president's push to kill the what we used to call the Green New Deal, right, which is largely the Inflation Reduction Act, where we had a whole new expansion into green energy in this country. I think that's mostly driven because he doesn't want to see a windmill off one of his golf courses and resorts. And then again, you have all of this, this big food, big pharma, and how does that relate to the RFK Jr. push for what we call MAHA, or Make America Healthy Again, right? And what does that mean for American farmers and food supply? So all of this coming at us. Challenges to success. What's the bandwidth we have for all of this here in Washington? What's sort of the activists that are going to react to this? The Democratic states, the blue states out there, and what are our wild cards? So I think about this, and usually I let this slide build and sort of talk about each one of these, but I wanted to throw it up this morning or this afternoon so you can all look at it, right? Healthcare dominated. You guys remember this all too well. 2009 and the early parts of 2010 were completely dominated by the effort to pass the Affordable Care Act, right? There wasn't much discussion of anything else in Washington. It was all about that. We flipped the corner around that. Republicans retake the House, and all of a sudden deficit and spending issues dominate 2011. You had things like the super committee. We didn't wear capes, but we thought about it. You had the Bowles-Simpson Commission, right? Looking at how you can tackle things like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and get the fiscal house in order. Dominated 2011. 2013, immigration and the border started to pop back up. 2017, Donald Trump's first year in office, tax reform, after a quick attempt to repeal the Affordable Care Act, went like this in the Senate, thanks to John McCain. But tax reform dominated 17 and the implementation in 18. Once he gets done with that in 2018 and 2019, he starts to find the power of tariffs, and that dominates Washington and starts to reorganize how we think about economics as the Republican Party. You go to 21 and 22, post-pandemic, you're thinking of the industrialization again, industrial policy, the CHIPS Act, the Infrastructure Act, all of these things to sort of get America back in front and leading on some of these global issues. This is all happening at once right now. Now, as a Republican in this town, I'm not often quoting Lenin, unless it's John, but if you go back in Russian history, there's this great Lenin quote from Lenin that talks about how there are decades where nothing happens, and then there are weeks where decades happen. Right now, we are living in a time where decades are happening inside of weeks. That's what Washington feels like right now. Because again, we're taking on healthcare. See the Affordable Care Act piece this week. Deficit spending. You saw the debt deal that just passed, debt limit this summer, the drive to cut $2 trillion from the federal government being pushed by congressional Republicans. Immigration, border, what the president's doing down at the southern border, and the demand for more monies. Tax reform, you've got a $4.7 trillion tax hike coming at the end of the year. Congress has to act. Trade wars, we already just went over that, right? The industrial policy piece, again, how do we drive and reshore all of these factories? How do we get them out of Asia, and how do we bring them back home? All of this is happening right now, not just in 25 and 26 as we put up there, but frankly happening in the spring of 25. In those first 8-9 weeks of this administration. So it really is kind of a question, what is the bandwidth not only for Washington, but for the country to be able to take all of this? And then the question becomes, usually when we see these types of moments, there's a resistance that comes on. George W. Bush met MoveOn.org and the Occupy Wall Street push. Barack Obama saw the rise of the Tea Party, the early foundations of the MAGA movement. Donald Trump, we saw the resistance rise, both in the Me Too, Black Lives Matter, all coming back and rising up against. You see Biden get elected, you have the woke lash, the protests against Disney and Target and others coming back into there. And the question right now is, what is that resistance going to look like for Donald Trump and the Republicans as we head into this year? We don't yet know what it's going to be. Will it be a repeat of his first term? Will there be a new organization? And I think part of this too goes back to my earlier comment that Democrats don't have a national leader to help organize this right now. So the party's trying to figure out just exactly which voice will come to the front or which voices will dominate that front. So this leaves us thinking about, what are the states going to do? And the interesting part about the states right now is you have a massive amount of one-party control. This hasn't always been true in the country's history, and it's gotten better or worse, as you may feel about some of these, right? But we now have 38 states where you have uniparty control, basically. And so what are they going to do? And more importantly, what are the attorney generals going to do? Because often it's the attorney generals who will sue the federal government to sort of figure these pieces out, which is why we watch at what these courts will do in the multi-state lawsuits versus administration. I'm going to bet Donald Trump beats his record of 160 filings we saw against the first Trump administration, though Biden certainly held his own at 131. So big resistance from the states and from unified controls there. And then there's the wild cards, right? Whatever you think of Donald Rumsfeld, one of my favorite quotes of all time is, of course, there's the known unknowns and the unknown unknowns, right? And this is kind of the black swan type argument. Like, what are we not seeing that's coming? You can guess at some of these, right? What's going to happen in the financial markets? We know Trump historically has been very sensitive to what happens in the stock market. Apparently not this week. For those of you at or near retirement, I hope you adjusted it properly. But there's huge chaos right now in the financial markets. What will that mean, and how will that or will that not steer him off course? Public opinion, again, I went back. He's riding high right now, which means drawing even. But that's high for him. Does that start to tank? Does he start to lose those moderates and the independents that came to him during the campaign? Does the Republican base start to stay with him as these programs that impact their lives start to hit? What are the events, whether they be particularly violent events, whether they be actions on the global stage and war, or whether they be protests here like we saw in the first Trump administration. And then obviously the big question is the courts. Where are they going to side? So far they've mostly sided against him. He's got a few victories early on, but even the few cases that have made it to the Supreme Court so far, his hand has been weakened a little bit. So these are the big things we've got to kind of question about here. And what does all this mean as we start to go to the Hill, right? So, well, this is interesting. The rest of the map didn't show. Karen, I got the same problem you had earlier. All my states are grayed out, but that's all right. The interesting thing is we think about Washington right now, and yes, Republicans only have 53 seats in the Senate, and most things in the Senate, most things, not everything, but most things need 60 votes. So where do you find those 7 Democrats to come along and agree with the Republicans and Donald Trump? Well, you've got 10 of them sitting in states he won. That one blue state up there is actually still held by a Republican, Susan Collins. I don't know whether Susan Collins is going to run for re-election or not in Maine, but I would almost guarantee you if she does, she wins. There are few senators in the history of the country who have been able to define that kind of iconic independent stature. She is one of them. It'll be a tough race if she decides to run again, but I think it's one she wins. So you look at all these states, a couple of them, Michigan has an open seat, Georgia has an open seat, though they're the reason there are 2 in those 2 states is because they're both held by Democrats right now. But you've got 2 races that are open right now in Michigan. How are those senators going to vote? You look at Pennsylvania, Nevada, Wisconsin. All of those are up in 2028 when the president's up, or when whoever goes to replace the president will be up. So you've got a lot of members right now in the United States Senate wondering, what are their politics back home? How do they walk this fine line? When do they decide to compromise, and when do they decide to be the resistance? But it does give the Senate, Republicans in the Senate, a path to get to 60 if they can hold together and if they can leverage these 10 seats here. Now on the House side, as an old House guy, this one pains me a little, right? This is about the narrowest majority in the history of Congress. The Speaker right now holds a 2-seat or a 4-seat majority and a 2-vote majority. So this week he could only lose 2. He lost 1, right? He was 1 vote away from the government shutting down or forcing a whole new discussion and negotiation with the Democratic Party. And if you look at this even more so, what's going to happen to Republicans? We're going to get shellacked in the midterms. That's what history says. If you go back to the 1940s, you can see the president's party almost always loses seats and almost always loses a lot of seats in the midterms. Now, the 2 years that didn't happen, 1998, Bill Clinton post-impeachment, when Republicans overreached on the Monica Lewinsky scandal. Democrats picked up 5 seats that election. 2002, George W. Bush post 9/11, right? I don't know if we've got a, ooh, I was almost going to say that oddly. We're just going to skip ahead. Let's hope we don't have either of those, right? But that's the kind of moment it took to buck the trend here. Now, I will say the reason my Republican friends have a little bit of hope here is that there are currently 3 Republicans sitting in seats in the House that Joe Biden won. There are 13 Democrats sitting in seats that Donald Trump won, right? So in theory, if that holds, that should be a plus 10 for the Republicans. But again, we know midterm elections, as this chart shows, are very different than presidential elections, the motivations. It tends to be people who are angry who turn out, people who are celebrating whatever victory their party just got in the first 2 years don't turn out nearly as much. So again, very shaky and very questionable that the Republicans will be able to hang on to the House this year. Again, leading back to that urgency we talked about at the beginning of this. So what do we need to know and what do we need to do as we think about this? I think one of the things we learned, and we looked across all of our clients, which is how do we align our ask with Trump priorities? This isn't a question about us reprioritizing or setting new principles, but how do we align our ask with Trump priorities? So, Karen, you mentioned ICRAs earlier, right? ICRAs were an administrative creation in Trump 1.0. So how do we sort of start to think through what are the pieces and what are the benefits and what are they trying to do with ICRAs that also happen to apply to other account-based benefits programs, right? How do we use that language? How do we line? How do we meet the moment that is a Donald Trump-dominated Washington? I think the other piece, which is what you guys are all doing here, right? Engage with your councils, engage with like-minded industries, try and figure out and get the band together again. It was better to be in the collective than isolated during the Trump administration in 1.0. I think lastly, this engage everyone piece is for us to also remember the long term, right? As I just talked about on the last slide, most likely in a couple of years, well, in 2 years, you will probably definitely see one of my Democratic colleagues back up here for me. I saved them to have to listen to me talk about a Republican-dominated Washington today. But probably in 4 years, she'll save me, so she'll talk about an entirely Democratic-controlled Washington. But this is why we need to keep engaging and why we'll go up and we'll talk to Republicans, we'll talk to Democrats, we'll talk to independents, because we have to play the long game. Let the pendulum swing here in Washington. We need to make sure we're talking to everybody and getting new champions across the board. So keep the long term in mind as we go up here. I think the other really thing that's interesting about this is we've thought about this, and we think about engaging with members of Congress and the administration. If you think about what's not trusted and what is trusted in America today, right? Everybody hates Congress. You guys have heard me, it's like 8% approval rating, and I don't want to meet that 8%. Those are crazy people. But you know what? Most people still love their representative. They went to high school with them. They see them around town. Yeah, maybe doesn't agree with me everything. Maybe she can be a little stiff on this. But you know what? Our families grew up together. We know them. We see them. We like them. It's great. You know what I don't like? It's big business. Man, corporate America sucks. They're out there screwing the little guy all the time. But man, I got a good job at Ford. Right? I got good retirement benefits. Yeah, we're playing around. It's hardball, and I'm paying a little bit more in my copay than I used to, but I'm pretty good. Boy, the media sucks. They're terrible. They're lying to everybody. But what I love is Fox News. Okay, for you liberals out there, MSNBC. Okay, that's all right. We'll get it. For you confused people, CNN. Right? But this is the thing, right? Like, you don't like the institution, but you like the version you chose of it. Maybe it's your podcast, right? National economy sucks. I'm doing all right. 401k took a hit this week, but generally I'm feeling good about where things are going. So we like to say, usually, again, this is a safer line when my Democratic colleague is here. Like, man, the Dems are crazy. I don't know, but Caitlin, I love Caitlin. She's great, right? We work together on all these issues. I can't wait till she has her first baby. It's going to be great. We're going to have them over this summer. We're going to barbecue, and it'll be fun, right? And so this is this kind of the things we perceive from afar, right? The things we can keep at arm's reach, we tend not to like. I'm really shocked that Bruce Mehlman used IRL here because I'm not so sure he knew what in real life meant. Or maybe I'm just jealous that I had to look it up. But these things that we experience firsthand are things we start to trust. And they break down those preconceptions of what we have about that group that's coming in to see me. And that's why it's so important that you guys are up here today, because you are in real life. You are that firsthand experience. You are in these people's districts, right? It matters more to me in many ways that you go up there and say, hey, I'm from this town. We've got these employers and these are our issues. Because that way, when we go back in next week and next month, they think, oh, right, I know those people. I like those people, right? They had some good thoughts to share with us. Now let me spend some time with Sage or Sarah, and we'll go into the details and figure out how this legislation actually works, right? But the ability to be up there and to break down these preconceptions and to be that IRL factor is critical to the success of ECFC going up to the Hill. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions. If you enjoy any of the individual slides, our founder, Bruce Mehlman, does a weekend Substack. It's free. If you need 6 charts on a Sunday morning, I don't know why you do, but feel free to log in. It's free. You can take a picture of it. But with that, happy to take any questions you guys might have. Uh-oh. Oh, Phil, I thought I was getting right up front. Maura.
I know you're Republican, but are there anybody on the Democratic Party showing like they'll be the next leader? Anybody?
So it's funny. This morning I was at the office early, and I was wandering down the halls and saw one of my Democratic colleagues, and we had a long conversation about this. And the answer is not yet. And again, I really do. I think back to how Republicans felt in 2007, after the 2006 election, right? Where Democrats had 60 votes in the Senate. They had a huge majority in the House. We had John Boehner. I worked very closely with him and his team for a lot of years, have great respect for them, but it wasn't that national figure. Mitch McConnell was just becoming the first time minority leader. Didn't have that national, we didn't have it, right? We were in search of it. Apparently we didn't get it for quite a few years later. And so no, right now, I think they're trying to figure out, right? There's the governors. You've got Gavin Newsom, who clearly wants to be president of the United States out in California. You've got Gretchen Whitmer out in Michigan, who's looking at it. You've got some senators who are trying to figure that role out. I don't quite see yet Hakeem Jeffries, very interesting and substantive individual, but hasn't quite taken command of the national stage yet out of the House. I would also say what I get from my Democratic colleagues right now is it's not just that kind of we lost and we lost badly, and it's also at the same time we're kind of having a generational leadership or leadership change that kind of compounds all of that. I think the thing that my Democratic colleagues face right now that we did not face in 2007, right? When Barack Obama came into office, he wanted to go focus on the Affordable Care Act. He was not trying to undo the big wins we felt we had early on in the Bush administration, right? And yeah, I guess he wanted to kind of tweak some of the taxes, but we were eager to have that fight. And one that ultimately in 2012 we won. We got about 98% of those Bush tax cuts, right? The difference this time around, a lot of the things Donald Trump is going after, right, are core democratic values and huge victories. It is the Affordable Care Act, right? It is DE&I initiatives that started to happen. It is environmental policy, withdrawing from the Paris Agreement, et cetera, right? These were big, the Inflation Reduction Act, right? The shift to green energy. These were big core constituencies. And so there's just kind of this twofer that my Democratic colleagues are kind of suffering through right now, which and doesn't help this week. They're going to take a loss on the continuing resolution, where I think the Senate Democrats this afternoon will probably vote for it because they don't want the government to shut down, but they also don't feel like they have any choice. There's no negotiating leverage, right? Because the House Republicans miraculously pulled it off. So I think it's going to take some time. Frankly, I think some of that question will come out of, is there a resistance? Is there a state that starts to really challenge and push back on some of the things Republicans are doing in Washington? But it may, frankly, take to the next campaign before we really see that come to fruition. So, yeah.
Sage, first of all, thank you. I always appreciate your insights on this. Going back to the tax cuts and trying to understand, when we think about tax cuts, and I get why they're doing all this, but how do the Republicans balance the cuts that are being proposed against Medicaid, right? The talk of cuts against Social Security and Medicare. How are they balancing that politically, knowing that their constituent base is very much, they have a large constituent base that are benefiting from those programs and have said vocally many times, don't touch them?
Yeah, my guess is not well. So I will say this, on Social Security right now, Social Security cannot be touched in a reconciliation bill. So they can't go there, at least in that bill. Medicare, the president has been repeatedly clear they're not going after, and so far the discussions haven't focused on Medicare. I put a little asterisk there, but so far not there. But Medicaid, right? Program for low-income Americans, women and children, infant children, is definitely. Now, I know the speaker rightfully says you can go ahead and, do a Control F for Medicaid and can't find it in the reconciliation language. He's right, you cannot. But it is squarely the target of this bill, and to the tune of hundreds of billions of dollars. And so you were talking about, to your point, right, a lot of Republicans, voters who rely on Medicaid to provide health care, particularly rural, lower income America. Kind of what you traditionally think of as a base Republican voter in many ways. So that's a struggle right now. And at times the president said, no, you're not touching Medicaid. And so what you've seen Republicans try to do is try and reframe the debate to program integrity or waste, fraud, and abuse. So the way they sit there and say, like, okay, the Biden administration, and even going back to the Affordable Care Act, did massive expansions of Medicaid. So it's no longer targeted at the core population that it was originally intended to over the last 4 decades. So let's refocus it back to there. Now, when you refocus it, you're obviously shrinking the program, but that's one way they try and talk about that. They talk about certain populations, right? Are we allowing undocumented Americans to be on the program? Are you recertifying on a regular basis income levels to make sure people are eligible for the program, right? These are all ways to message the fact that you're going to try and limit both the value of the benefit and the breadth of the benefit. But that's where the calculus is for Republicans right now, is can they keep that focus? The reason I put an asterisk on Medicare is you can start to do some of those things as well, right? Some program integrity type pieces. Now in Medicare, a little harder to redefine eligibility, like you're either that age or you're not. I guess maybe you could have a fake birth certificate and get on a couple years early, but that's not really the problem with Medicare. You could think through, are there ways to not cut the core benefit, but again, streamline the program, like site neutral payments. So this notion that when I go to the hospital for a procedure, I pay $100, but when I go across the street to the clinic, I pay $50 for that. Shouldn't it just be $50 no matter where I am, right? Those are kind of the program integrity types things that if they go back into Medicare, I haven't made that decision yet. So that's going to be a real question. Can they message that to program integrity, waste, fraud, and abuse, and those types of things? Or will America just view it as a cut? Meanwhile, you just did those massive tax cuts. And by the way, when you did those massive tax cuts, my taxes stayed the same, so whose taxes did you cut? That's a problem. I mean, that's a political problem. I spent about 10 years doing campaigns before I came to Washington. And I'll tell you, as an old campaign guy, that's a real problem. And it's going to be a challenge for my Republican friends up on the Hill to try and message, how do I balance these tax cuts? I think that's why, frankly, the president wants to do things like no taxes on tips, right? He wants a really popular program for every tipped employee in the country to say, hey, I just saved you a few bucks. He wants to be able to tell everybody who's working overtime, there's no taxes on overtime, right? And so it's that balancing act, that political balancing act of, maybe you felt it here, but I was really just trying to get at the core program, plus I gave you some new stuff, and will that work politically? It's an unknown. It's a big risk, but also pretty anathema to Republicans to go ahead and allow a $4.7 trillion tax increase at the end of the year. What else? Anything fun?
Hang on.
Mr.
We
Stewart.
do need to ask the questions in the mic because we are recording.
Sage, curious, you've talked a lot about the legislative. Within the administration, Domestic Policy Council, I think Theo Merkel was reappointed. I don't know whether that requires consent. Okay, so back in his position where he was at as the key healthcare advisor, he's the one who gave us IRS Notice 2019-45 on the chronic conditions. What can we expect out of that office? Does Theo have a legitimate voice in policy? Are we going to be able to see some stuff done through regulation, through the Eisenhower building that we don't see through Congress?
Since this is re-recording, I will say my dear friend Theo has a very loud and important voice on this policy matter. Kidding aside, yes, I mean, Theo is going to be a critical voice. I think much the way we saw the notice you talked about, much the way we saw ICRA's, much the way we saw the announcement not last night, the day before, on the sort of special enrollment periods. Like, there is clearly going to be a huge administrative drive to change these policies. In fact, probably one of the things I ought to update our slide for is, like, this time around, Donald Trump is not waiting on Congress to deliver results, right? In 2017, Donald Trump wanted to do a tax bill. In Congress, Paul Ryan at the time, the Speaker of the House, said, no, we're going to do health care, we're going to repeal the Affordable Care Act, and we're going to do a premium support model. That failed miserably. Then moved on in the fall to taxes. This time, Donald Trump's not waiting for it. Right now, Congress is begging him to leave some of these programs along so that they can get credit for the savings. to your point, make those, that balancing act a little easier. This time he's like, nope. Again, I just did $100 billion last night through regulatory order. So yes, I think we're going to have, whether it's Theo or others, a lot of administrative action in these spaces. And the interesting thing about the Trump administration, especially as it comes to healthcare, right? The president is not a huge healthcare guy himself. But you have this balancing act between the Theo Merkels of the world, who are very traditional, conservative, free market healthcare people, and sort of the populist, it's tough competition over here. No. I don't know whether to get closer, to get back in view, or just to move it this way. Yeah, sure, yes. Hey, it's DC, what'd you expect, okay? Like, come on. It's not a bug, it's a feature. Yeah, that's right, it's not a bug, it's a feature. Somebody watched and paid attention to the slides, thank you. So where do we go between this sort of populist tension, right, of giving away benefits and providing popular things, and the tension between sort of what I think of as more the classical conservative thinkers inside the administration on healthcare, where I'd put Theo and folks like, not inside the administration, but influencing from the outside, the Paragon Institute and Brian Blaze, who's really just kind of what I would call is the, apologies here, but is the it girl in healthcare policy amongst Republicans these days. And so it's a fascinating question to see who wins out here. It was a tension in the first Trump administration, where I tended to think the more classical conservative free market folks won out. But now that you have RFK, and to a lesser extent Dr. Oz, leading healthcare, it's going to be interesting to see kind of how those two power centers play out. But yeah, I think they're going to try and do as much administratively as possible, even if it doesn't help their friends on the Capitol Hill.
There was another question over here. I don't know, remember who it was?
I get, oh, it's loud. So it seems like on the macro level, the administration's philosophy is to replace public spending and stimulus with private spending and stimulus. And I think part of the reason why you saw the market draw down this week is they're starting to acknowledge, hey, there could be a recession in between those two engines. And like you said, Trump is not normally a patient person, but that seems like something that's going to take some time. How do the other Republicans that you work with think about that?
Privately or publicly? I mean, it's
yeah, either one.
Yeah, so I would say this. I think there are still a large number of Republicans who are very uneasy with what I would call sort of the global trade agenda, and more specifically the use of tariffs to sort of remake the American economy. I would also say there are a number of Republicans who view, to the extent that there is a view on a positive view towards using tariffs, it is a very bilateral, right? Like, I have a problem with that country, and they're not negotiating with me over this agreement, so I am going to use it in this space, right? What Trump has decided, right, is, hey, I've got a problem with Mexico and drugs, and so I'm going to slap a tariff on them. Like, that's just, I mean, right? I mean, screw, nail, doesn't matter. I got a hammer and it's going through the wood, right? I mean, and that's kind of how I think this administration views the tariff tool. That's not a very traditional Republican view. And so there's a lot of concern about that. I think at the same time, there is very much, you look at Josh Hawley in the Senate, you think of even a Jason Smith, chair of the Ways and Means Committee. You've got a new, more populist Republican, and I would say sort of a post-90s Republican, who sat around and saw the downside. And I do think this. I would still consider myself personally in the free trader camp. But I would also say what I think Republicans got wrong about trade and globalism was we didn't do enough to recognize the fact that the benefit is very dispersed, but the pain is very localized, right? I can drive by the factory in Greenville, Michigan, that employed 3 generations of refrigerators makers producers, technicians, electricians, plumbers, janitors, shop floor managers, etc. Right? That's where a cousin, an uncle, an aunt, and a grandmother worked. And it's hollowed out. What I do know, actually I just looked at this, my refrigerator's not cheap, but what I do know, right, is that global trade made a lot of products cheaper, right? So the benefits were dispersed. They went all across the country. Everyone trying to buy a refrigerator had a cheaper refrigerator than they probably would have had that plant stayed open. But if I'm driving by that plant, right, and so how do you do that? And where this president wants to go, and I think where a growing number of Republicans are willing to sort of give him the room to go, is to say, hey, how do we get that plant back? Right? How do we get, as the president said in the joint address, how do we start, reignite a shipbuilding industry in this country? We're not just talking about textiles in the South or manufacturing in the upper Midwest, right? Shipbuilding in the central South. How do all of these things start to come back through a more aggressive trade policy? And what are the repercussions? We know the farmers were willing to give him that runway in Trump 1.0. I think business and a lot of the Republicans are starting to, but there's a lot of nervousness. But on trade specifically, Congress for the past 5 decades basically gave administrations that authority. There are few powers I can think of that a president has more unilateral authority over than trade, and more specifically tariffs. And there are even some dormant powers nobody's used since the 1920s that technically are on the books, and we all just kind of laughed at and thought like, well, nobody's going to use that process anymore. Guess what? If they need to, they will. So there's kind of an unease, frankly. And so publicly, the reason I said privately and publicly is publicly there are very few voices saying they think the president's wrong on that. Sometimes they say, I wish he was more targeted, right? But that's about as much as you'll get. It's from a very select few. Privately, you get a lot more nervousness about what is that short-term pain? Is it worth the long-term gain? Is the long-term gain even possible? And so that's kind of a nervousness, but they also don't have a lot of recourse on it. Any other questions? Ernie up front. Come on, Nikki, get your running shoes on.
I'm coming.
So I just want to real quick tack on the definition of short term, right? Because I think we could all agree you can't build a cold rolled steel to shipbuilding infrastructure in 18 months when it's not here now. So is it even practical to think that you could reshore these industries in the time afforded?
Well, what I know is that on my father's side of the family, the Eastmans, and on my mother's side of the family, the Millicans, I am the tallest Millican and the shortest Eastman. So your question about how do we define short is a little personal for me. I love a Millican family reunion, less so on the Eastman side. I think that's is an excellent question, and I don't know what the end game there is. I really do think the way I've described this before is the president kind of has a view of that there's a cancer, right, in America, and he's willing to go through the chemo and the radiation, right? As we all know, those are things that are designed to kill portions of your body, right? And so that level of pain and that seriousness of it is worth the potential to get ourselves out of this. And if that, I'm not so sure I buy that the president is in a short-term game or even a medium-term game. I think he is in a long-term game. I think the Commerce Secretary, I think Peter Navarro and all those folks are in a long-term game. The question will be, much as he did in Trump 1.0, right? He did a lot of money to the farmers to try and help mitigate those things, is can we, through those other stimulus matters you talked about, right? Is it a new industrial policy that floods the field with a whole lot of infrastructure or money for chip manufacturers? energy production, et cetera, right? Can those things sort of start to help balance those out and keep the markets a little bit confused, and more importantly, keep the actual economy where jobs matter and wages matter a little more confused? I think that's the short-term adjustment they're trying to figure out. But I do think this is a long-term effort to try and redo this. Because no, you're not going to reshore, we're not going to have a textile industry in the South that hasn't been there for, decades. You're not going to recreate these industries whole cloth, but maybe what you can do is start to get a factory here or there. And again, I do think if the president follows through and really does do the tariffs he's looking at, I think you can see, the financials will change, right? And we all know governors love to do tax-free deals for you to put a new factory in your state. So, you'll pay no state taxes, you'll get a low, federal corporate tax rate, and maybe in 10 years, Greenville, Michigan's producing refrigerators again. Instead of, now some of that went to South Carolina, but most of it went to Mexico. So we'll have to see how this plays out, but I think this is, I think from the president's standpoint, very much is a generational fight to sort of reclaim a domestic manufacturing base, to put it simply. We got one more? I feel like I'm running over. I don't want to.
We'll take another one. Got a few more minutes.
Listen, you paid for the microphone. I'll stay all day, but.
Deal. Just kidding.
Thank you. Thank you. Do you have any comments or just thoughts in general on this administration, or either both sides of the aisle as it relates to AI? Specifically, when you think about the Fed's dual mandate of price stability and maximum employment, and if you kind of have been following this, Elon the other day said, Grok will be able to replace any cognizant job within 3 years. So, how that relates to specifically the Fed's dual mandate and how this administration may be preparing for the eventuality that is likely to come.
I like to preface this with I can't spell AI, so you've hit a topic that more of my colleagues do a lot of work in. Again, I'm not. I think if you look at where the Trump administration is, they've decided to sort of blow up the Biden rule on AI. They don't yet know what to replace it with. If you look at Congress, they're in kind of an awkward space. Some of the House Republicans a year ago said no policies on AI, right? We don't want to cramp the market. We want to kind of let the innovation happen out there. I think this is going to take time for everyone. To sort of understand, and much like, I liken this a little bit to the privacy space, where there's a lot of different uses here, right? Privacy, when I'm talking about my Target credit card, is a lot different than privacy when I'm talking about my health records, right? And so where does this kind of play out in the AI space, right? What does AI mean when I don't have a medicine, a drug that's designed for an entire population? It isn't even designed for what we consider a rare disease, so less than 30,000 cases globally, but is literally designed for me and me alone. Right? Like that's a very different use of AI than how do we sort of do what I think Elon was talking about in the workplace. I don't think, we jokingly say Washington's famous for two things, underreacting and overreacting. I'm going to put us in the underreacting category for a little while. And I don't think, and as long as that happens, then the Fed mandate question is a little bit moot until we sort of figure out and kind of get there, because the Fed's not going to have the activity there. I just don't think there are the expertise quite yet within the administration, any administration, frankly, and certainly not within Congress. I would say if you're interested in this space, Jay Obernolte is a fascinating person to watch in this space. California, MIT grad, I believe, if I have that right, but is somebody who actually, like, one of those few, like, years ago, Congress actually had a rocket scientist. Bill, do you remember who it was? Vern Ehlers of Michigan was literally a rocket scientist. We don't have a lot of AI engineers, let alone, you know, you first kind of have to think about what is the philosophical setting and regulations that you want to approach all these issues with. So I think that's just going to take some time, and it's going to have to, there's going to have to be a symbiotic relationship between the developers out there and the regulators here in Washington, and how do you balance that out? And when does one act? I'm not so sure I have a good answer for yet, just because I think there's still a lack of knowledge, and as long as there's a lack of knowledge, I think generally Republicans will want the marketplace to decide those issues for fear of sort of crushing innovation. And that's going to be the tension probably over the next 5-10 years, is between innovation and safeguards on these fronts. But I do think you'll also probably see in the marketplace what I'll simplify as sort of that good housekeeping seal of approval start to develop, right? What are those NGO type commissions that sort of say, hey, these folks have done it right? And you'll probably start to see the states, in fact, some states have already done this. I think California's done it, Texas just skipped on it, Florida's thinking about it. There's a few other states that are thinking about it, where you get a little bit of a safe harbor if you've been kind of certified in that space. But again, how do you do those certifications? Who's doing the standards testing, the application usage pieces? But I think you'll probably see a little bit of that experimentation at the state, and the states will act a little bit more so before you see the feds match. So, but again, I can't spell AI, so take that all with a grain of salt. Thank you, everyone. Look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Enjoy the weather.